you don't need my assistance. We all know how change happens in this country. It happens through the struggle and sacrifice of people from below. It doesn't happen through ranting journalists who look like they're 12 years old. I mean, that is how change happens. That's, I think we all know, struggle and fighting from below, working people uniting with those who have a common and shared interest as them. So that is obviously, I think, all of us, how we want to drive through change, how we want to build a mass movement, even though we disagree exactly on how that will take place. Now, it's come up a few times, this idea of historical precedent. Well, firstly, the point I was making is this, because people say, well, you're saying there's never been a precedent for a left of Labour party, but then again, there's never been socialism in this country, as John said, and yet, obviously, you want socialism. The point I make is this: there are lots of precedents in the last 112 years of the left achieving a mass base, of getting several MPs elected, of not only getting councillors elected, but actually taking control out of councils through the Labour Party. That is an established precedent which has happened. And, you know, a book which I remember growing up with, a city that dared to fight about Liverpool, which is something you're all very proud of in this room. So there clearly is that precedent. There isn't a precedent, as I've said, for any other route of achieving that, of taking control of an entire council, of getting several MPs elected, and of getting tens of thousands of mobilised activists. It just hasn't happened. And I'd say also, if we're going to be honest, you're not quite looking to recreate the Labour Party, well, first the LRC of the 1900, the Labour Party of 1905, which has been discussed, didn't even announce itself as a socialist party. You're trying to create something which is quite different, which is an explicitly mass socialist party. Preferably, I suppose, in many of your cases, you'd want it to have a revolutionary programme. So you're not actually looking to replicate what existed before. Now, in terms of looking at other examples like Greece and so on, now I just want to make this clear, I don't support the idea of exceptionalism, the idea that Britain has some sort of exceptional political culture compared to Greece or elsewhere. But it is true that somewhere like Greece, there is an established tradition of a mass far-left party, and that, firstly, the Communist Party. Syriza has effectively eclipsed them in that sense. It's the same in France, and it's the same in other countries too. We don't have, as of yet, that tradition. We don't have a tradition of a mass left of social democratic party to pass on the mantle in the way, take in France, the mantle's gone from the Communist Party to other parties. So it is a different situation entirely, I'd argue. Now, in terms of looking at the Labour Party, this idea, well, look, there's not a, if it was to change, it'd be in a mass, it'd have to be on a mass basis. Tens of thousands of people would have to flock. But to be honest with you, in the aftermath of the coalition, tens of thousands of people did join the Labour Party. In fact, I think it was about 45,000. You can argue that's nowhere near enough, but it's far more than the entire collective membership of all left parties in this country, times quite a few numbers. So this idea that hasn't been, if you like, a shift in terms of people looking to the Labour Party, and I'd say this, they're not looking at it out of the fact they think they're inspired by the Labour leadership. Of course that's not true. It's in despair of what's happening under the Tories. Again, I mean, if we're looking at the polls, what's happened according to opinion polls is this. There's been all of those working class voters who stopped voting, refused anymore to support the Labour Party. They sat on their hands rather than vote because they didn't defect to the Conservatives. As I said, Labour lost 5 million votes. The Tories only won 1 million votes, more than they did when they were routed in 1997. But there has been, according to the polls, in truth, a shift from those working class voters back into the Labour camp. It just can't be ignored. That's why Labour's on 44% or so on in various polls. That's because even though many middle class voters, as the polls show, are still opting for the Conservatives, there's been a shift by working class voters who are just desperate for an alternative. So again, they're not flocking into the arms of parties like this. And that's the other point I've made. Why, after 4 years since this crisis began, has there not been a dramatic upsurge of members going into the party, going into the arms of parties like this? I don't know, maybe your membership has increased slightly, but it hasn't certainly exploded in size in a way you might hope for during a very protracted crisis of capitalism, and at a time when, frankly, there isn't much enthusiasm for the Labour leadership. So the question is, if it hasn't happened up to these 4 years since Lehman Brothers crashed, why is it going to change all of a sudden in the next 4 years, particularly when what will happen in the next election election is people will be so desperate to get rid of the Tories, you'll actually see your vote probably squeezed even more than it was at the last general election. So again, I don't see what the basis is all of a sudden dramatic shift into the arms of parties like this. Now, in terms of talking about, I'm glad John raised this point, a very key point. If it's a case of, for example, being disgusted at a right-wing leadership and not separating the leadership from the movement, why not apply the same logic to various trade unions? Now, I'm glad we've got many PCS reps in this room, and many PCS reps will remember this struggle in a way I don't at the time. PCS used to be run by a very, very right-wing leadership, Heemskerk. I mean, a lot of them, as you'll remember, were pretty thuggish. Now, you could have adopted the strategy at that time of going, well, sod this, I could deflee my cats, and I could go off and, use my time in a better, more effective way, rather than fighting against Heemskerk's thugs. Well, thank God that didn't happen. Because, of course, there was a dramatic shift. It might have seemed completely unlikely under Heemskerk, but there was a dramatic shift. And, of course, PCS now is one of the main fighting trade unions in this country, led by one of the most inspirational trade union leaders, I'd argue, we've ever even had in this country. So how things are now, because of a certain leadership, doesn't mean that is the way things will always remain. Now, this idea we're living through exceptional times, as Nancy said, yeah, we are living through exceptional times, but the 1930s were pretty exceptional as well. And we didn't, again, get a mass left party then, despite the best efforts of people like my great-uncle in the Independent Labour Party. Now, she spoke also in the anti-war movement, and actually that just goes to show how putting pressure on the Labour, and this might sound an odd thing to say, given you Labour prosecuted that murderous war which killed hundreds of thousands of people. But actually that anti-war movement showed how pressure from below works. Because 139 Labour MPs ended up voting against that war precisely because so many people came on the streets. In fact, that war only happened on the back of Conservative votes because only 11 Tory MPs voted against it. So that itself is a vindication of pressure from below, of demands from below, and how that actually had a profound impact. Now, in terms of the Labour leadership, Andrew said over here, talks about him opposing strikes. Now, one of the interesting things about that is nearly every Labour activist I know was actually furious about Ed Miliband's position on those strikes. Overwhelmingly, you'll find Labour activists supported both of those strikes. Doesn't surprise me, a lot of them were actually on strike at the time. But actually, the Labour leadership has never supported a strike in this country. It didn't support the general strike, it didn't support the miners' strike, there's nothing new about that position. And of course, in the past, your predecessors would have made the difference between the leadership at the top and the movement as a whole. So of course, let's just not think that's a unique shift in terms of what has happened in the character of the Labour leadership, because it actually, I'm afraid it actually isn't. What would it take for me to leave the Labour Party, Jackie? Quite simply, it would have to mean the severing of the trade union link. There would no longer be a Labour Party in this country. It would then be something like the US Democratic Party. I have no sort of emotional attachment, if you like, to the idea of the Labour leadership, the Labour Party. It's not a dewy-eyed nostalgia, if you like. No, I'm not saying it is. I know you're not saying it is, but I'm saying I'm not sticking around for a bit of a laugh or because it's passed on through traditions. I'm doing it simply because I've made the decision that I do not see how we will get a new mass left party in this country to fight for the things that I see if we have not managed to do it in the last 112 years, and I don't see why that will suddenly change now. So I would say this, what we need to do from my position in terms of shifting the Labour leadership, kicking and screaming, if needs be, is to build pressure through the trade unions to use their power, their potential power within the Labour Party to oppose austerity, to put forward a coherent alternative, to not support, let's stop calling it a pay freeze for public sector workers, it's a pay cut. It's about 16% by the next Parliament, to put pressure from below on the Labour leadership, because politics isn't a soap opera. It's not the big men of history who determine what happens. It's people struggling from below and putting pressure on those at the top. But it also means creating political space for policies we support. Because I'll be honest with you, because of 30 years of reaction, and because of what this Tory government has done by turning a crisis of capitalism into a crisis of public spending. Things like, for example, the attack on the welfare state, the attacks on people who are disabled or unemployed, has been remarkably and devastatingly effective in winning the support of working class people in some cases. Now that shows we have to actually create political space within our own movement and within our own people. So it's not even just putting pressure on the people at the top, it's creating political space for the sorts of policies that we agree with, that we want to fight for. So all I'd say is this: I do think, in terms of the struggle against austerity and for a coherent alternative, we can agree on those. We can stand united and fighting for key demands, whether it be in terms of fighting to change this crisis from one that advantages the people at the top into turning a crisis of capitalism into an opportunity to build a Britain in the interest of working people and linking that to struggles abroad. We can unite on that basis. So as much as we disagree on the organisational element, which we're never going to agree on, if we're going to be brutally honest, I think just carry on doing what you're doing. If you have a sudden breakthrough in Hull or whatever, I will look at that with great interest. But at the moment, the only way I can see in advance is to drag the Labour leadership into a position from below, whether it wants to or not, of opposing what exists, and at the same time linking with people who profoundly disagree with me on that, and linking to them on an issue-by-issue basis, whether it be housing, whether it be the attacks on disabled people, whether it be the attacks on public sector pensions, whether it be working tax credits being taken away from part-time workers. We can unite and struggle on those issues. So let's do that, and above all else, let's keep having this debate and discussion in the fantastic camaraderie way we've had today. Thank you.
Owen, we'll go straight over to Clive, and then final contribution to the debate.
Well, I'd like to start by echoing Owen's points about the importance of this debate and the importance of the issues that have been raised. And of course, it has to continue because there are a whole range of issues and points that have been raised in this discussion, which is impossible for both Owen and myself to respond to. Now, I will start, however, with what Owen's starting point is. I will start with what Owen's starting point is, where he says that there's been no tradition of left of Labour parties being formed since the Labour Representation Committee. And I must say, it came out actually in the written debates, and it's come out again today. Owen makes the points about the collapse of Stalinism. He makes the points about this is a new historical era, but then he ignores them. He makes the points, correctly so, about the ANC being transformed completely. And we've seen the reality of the situation in South Africa. By the way, we talk about unions. Can they be, do you want to march out the unions? Perhaps we should go to South Africa and explain to the miners, well, they should go back inside to the NUM and try and fight the struggle that way. It's absolutely correct. To go out on the path of a new union organisation and a new political party in South Africa. That's actually the music of the future in relation to Britain as well. But the point is there seems to be a formal recognition that this is a new historical era. But all the examples that he gives are from the periods actually before the collapse of Stalinism, when you did have a broader socialist conscience. Owen himself said, why couldn't Gateskill abolish Clause 4 in 1960? It's because Anara Bevan was able to go to the Labour Party conference and say, you want to abolish socialism, but socialism works. Look at the Soviet Union. That's the reality. That wasn't our position, but that's the way the Labour lefts posed it at that stage. And that ideological defeat of the collapse of Stalinism, that third turning point in world history in the 20th century, did set the tone and tenor of the period that we enter in now. And of course, that doesn't make it easy to fight for a political representation, but as it wasn't easy for Keir Hardie in the 1880s and the 1890s, it wasn't easy for Keir Hardie when he got just 8% of the vote, which is a typical TUSC vote, actually slightly 2% higher than TUSC votes in our outings at the present time. It wasn't easy when Keir Hardie was ridiculed when the TUC, actually even as late as the 1900s, a member of the TUC political committee stood as a Tory party candidate in Oldham at that stage. It wasn't easy at that stage to conduct the battle for independent working class political representation, but it was a battle that had to be conducted. And this is a new historical era. This has allowed the capitalist wing of what was a capitalist workers' party to consolidate, entrench, and firm up their position. Of course, it's not exactly the same as the US Democrats. There's a different name. One's called Labour, one's called the Democrats. There's a different history. There's a slightly, even probably today, even in school textbooks, you have pictures of Keir Hardie going into the House of Commons, the first MP who didn't wear a top hat when he went into the Commons. So somewhere deeply rooted in consciousness, there might be the idea perhaps Labour was different in the past. So that, it's not exactly the same. But the reality is the structural, ideological, organisational changes that have been forced through have transformed the character of that party. It's what John Bridge said earlier on. Well, even if you say it's only a remote possibility, surely you can't throw away history there. Well, actually, we can't really afford to base ourselves on remote theoretical possibilities. That's like, I'm a proud supporter of Southend United football team, but when I want to look at support a team that can actually reach the Europa Cup or European Cup, I don't look to Southend United. I look perhaps to Manchester United or Tottenham or something like that. You have to have a sense of perspective as to how events will develop. And Owen makes the points in relation to the anti-war movement. And again, there's an interesting point there. That's an example. Owen said, I don't distort this, but example of the pressure that it was exerted, it does actually indicate even the ossified bureaucracy can have splits and so on. But the fact of the matter is, Blair took Labour to war, Britain to war. Labour took Britain to war. Compare that, for example, to the battle against the Vietnam War in the 1960s, where Wilson was under enormous pressure from the US imperialism to back the intervention in Vietnam, in a world situation where there was a clash of systems at that stage. But he couldn't get it through the Labour Party, and therefore Britain was stayed neutral in the Vietnam War compared to the situation there. And by the way, when we talk about historical, new historical periods, unprecedented periods, let's not forget that anti-war demonstration in February 2003, 9 years ago, or just over 9 years ago, was the biggest demonstration in British history. If the Labour Party had still been a capitalist workers' party, the Labour government would not have gone to war. That's absolutely crystal clear, because it would have been reflected through those structures. There would have been a turfing out of the leadership and a transformation of the Labour Party at that stage. That didn't happen, and it wasn't a flood of members into the Labour Party at that stage. And by the way, just on the figures in relation to surges, I don't want to get bogged down too much in figures, but I can't help resisting this, I'm afraid. In terms of this alleged surge to the Labour Party since the general election, in 2008, the elections for Labour's National Executive Committee, where every single individual member of the party has an individual vote, the leading left candidate, Christine Shawcross, has been re-elected to the Labour Party NEC for a number of years now, got 19,988 votes. 4 years later, for the exact same elections for the NEC, she was re-elected. Her vote had gone up to 22,000. In 4 years, since the beginning of the recession, the strength of the Labour left inside the Labour Party has gone up by 4,200 votes in that period. That's not, again, a massive... But not, that's a good point, But not, for example, the evolution of the RMT in the last period. In 2008, the RMT were not affiliated, TUSC didn't exist. In 2008, the RMT hadn't sponsored a national campaign against Labour, as they had done in the European elections. In 2008, the RMT was not affiliated or formally involved in TUSC. The POA was not formally involved in TUSC. The PCS didn't have a political ballot, which is now prepared to use to support anti-cuts candidates. The situation is moving. It's not a case of joining the Socialist Party. It's the case of how the working class can strive to create its own organisations, which it controls, to fight on the political plane. And I will end, because I have to end because of the time, on the last point actually, because Owen made the point, which again is, we have to take it on board, that the Conditions, the reason that there isn't an upsurge is because of the decline in trade unionism in Britain, decline in the shop stewards movement and so on. Let's just go back to 1900s. It's worthwhile actually looking back at that stage. How many trade unionists were there in Britain at that stage as a percentage of the workforce? 11% of the workforce was in the trade union. There was, spoke about miners, there were over 1 million people who were domestic servants. I live much Downton Abbey. I'm not sure if that's a generator of class consciousness, but I don't think domestic service is the area you look at that to develop. There are 11%, as I say, of the workforce in trade unions. The unions that came together to form the Labour Party represented 3% of the workforce. That's less than the non-affiliated unions, the PCS, the NUT, the UCU, the RMT, the FBU, the POA, and so on, which have political funds. They actually represent nearly 7% of the workforce, of the British workforce at this stage. There are more social forces gathered around even just the non-affiliated unions at this moment in time than there were that were gathered around the early Labour Party in 1900. And the issue is the subjective question, to force, to have a battle inside those unions, to have a battle inside the affiliated unions as well, to make sure the working class can establish an organisation that they can control, a political voice that they desperately need in this period to mount an effective struggle against austerity